A silent night in the Ardennes. The wind howled through the trees like wolves on the hunt. Snow blanketed the Ardennes forest in white silence, but beneath the stillness, war thundered like a drumbeat in the distance. It was Christmas Eve, 1944, and the world was burning. Inside a small wooden cabin nestled among the pines, 12-year-old Fritz Vinken stirred a pot of stew over a crackling fire. His mother, Elizabeth, moved silently behind him, placing candles on the windowsill. They were alone, her husband gone to war, their village reduced to ash. Yet here, in this isolated corner of Belgium, they had found a sliver of peace. Or so they thought. Then came the knock. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. Elizabeth froze. Fritz's heart pounded in his chest. Another knock, louder now, a pounding, urgent plea against the storm. Elizabeth cracked the door, her breath catching. Standing in the snow were 3 American soldiers. One barely conscious, blood darkening his sleeve. The other 2 held him up, eyes hollow with fatigue and fear. They were the enemy. She could be executed for this, harboring American soldiers in Nazi territory. But Elizabeth Vinken did not see uniforms. She saw boys, hungry, wounded, and far from home. Without a word, she stepped aside and ushered them in. They spoke no German. She spoke no English. But broken French bridged the silence. The fire warmed their frozen limbs. Fritz added more water to the stew. But peace, as ever, was fleeting. A second knock shattered the quiet. This one was calculated. Sharp. German. Elizabeth's face drained of color. If the Americans were found inside, she would not live to see morning. Nor would her son. She stood still, listening. Then, heart pounding, she opened the door. 4 German soldiers. They demanded shelter from the cold. Suspicion flickered in their eyes. They could smell the stew, hear the voices inside. Death hung in the air like the frost. And then, in a moment of breathtaking courage, Elizabeth stepped out into the snow. "This is Christmas Eve," she said calmly in German. "You may come in, but you must leave your weapons in the shed. I have guests, and tonight there will be peace." The soldiers exchanged glances. They could have laughed. They could have shot her on the spot. But something in her voice, in her unflinching stare, disarmed them more than any weapon could. One by one, the Germans placed their rifles in the shed. Inside, the cabin was silent as ghosts. The Americans tensed. The Germans scanned the room. Then, without a word, one of the German soldiers knelt beside the wounded American. He was a medic. He unrolled his bag and began tending the wound with practiced hands. Fritz watched, wide-eyed, as enemies became human again. They sat together around the table. The stew was thin, but there was enough. Mother read from the Bible, her voice soft, steady. No one spoke of war. No one mentioned the dead. For one sacred night, the battle paused, not by treaty, not by surrender, but by the will of a single woman who refused to let hate enter her home. They slept under one roof, not as soldiers, but as sons, as brothers, as men. In the morning, the Germans shared directions. A compass changed hands. They nodded once, then disappeared into the trees. The Americans followed soon after. Elizabeth Vinken never saw any of them again. But years later, her son Fritz, now a man living in Hawaii, would meet 2 of the Americans again. They embraced not as survivors, but as friends bound by a night that defied the very nature of war. And Fritz would carry that night with him forever. "I remember Mother and those 7 young soldiers," he would say, "who met as enemies and parted as friends in the middle of hell. Because sometimes the fiercest act of resistance is kindness, and sometimes the loudest cry for peace is silence on a battlefield."